everyone. Welcome back. Let's start the third day of the 7th PhilosophyCon. I will be just taking care of the technical stuff today, and now Adam Tkachuk will present our first panel and our guests, and after that we'll watch a pre-recorded video. Anyway, Adam, give it your best.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to meet you. I'm glad to be here to watch your presentations and to speak with you. I think it will be very nice to talk with you and know what you are working on. It will be very nice to. I hope you will enjoy it and to talk with you and know what you are working on. It will be very nice to. I hope you will enjoy it and to talk with you and know what you are working
Adam, maybe you could say something about our guests,
I hope you will enjoy it and to talk with you
this
and
panel.
Know what
introduce the video. Adam, maybe you could say something about our guests.
I hope you will enjoy it and
this panel.
Know what
introduce the video.
Adam,
maybe you could say something about our guests. Speakers and this panel. introduce the video. Adam, maybe you could say something about our guests. Speakers and this panel. introduce the video. Adam, maybe you could say
Marjan, will you join us? Now we Marjan, will you join
Hi, my name is Marianne Pierre. I'm an Australian speaker and fiction author with research interests in cyberfeminism and posthumanism. Thanks very much to Marianne Pierre and Australian universities for the invitation to speak to the session today. What a great celebration. Thanks very much for leadership through popular Australian universities. I really appreciate to speak to the session. So what a great celebration. Thanks very much. Bear with me one moment while I just share my screen, the inevitable screen sharing of Zoom. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about how social and community building behaviour of the post-human protagonists in fempunk fiction advances an idea of shifting feminine identity, one that's no longer defined by tendencies towards notions of a natural, inherent or gendered identity. And I'm going to illustrate this for you by looking at aspects of community in 3 fempunk novels. But before we step into that discussion, I thought it might be helpful to provide you with a couple of definitions. So when I use the word fempunk in the conversation today, I'm referring to women writing in the feminist post-cyberpunk science fiction space in the 2000s and onwards. And when I refer to posthumanism, I mean that kind of post-human state of being that exists in the splice space between the body and embodiment, not being restricted to one or the other. And I'm borrowing a Hale's quotation there to explain that. So the topic of gendered identity in fempunk became kind of interesting to me in a discussion with my PhD supervisor about whether or not science fiction actually offered new ways of thinking, or whether it merely served as a reflective metaphor for our current ways of living. So I dived in to explore this idea, beginning with how identity is prescribed when we talk about the concept of woman or women. So historically, the concept of women is discursively constructed, meaning, I suppose, that because we all assert and agree on it, it exists. So an example of this might be biologism, which defines women only within the context of their biological capabilities, particularly that of nurturing or of reproduction. Whereas philosophy draws on its need to characterise social organisations to create a definition of women. So these and many other multi-lens perspectives of how we prescribe identity suggest that what we mean by woman or women is a construction that should really be regularly interrogated. And what better or more perfect tool to do so than science fiction? With science fiction's ability to literalise metaphors and push the boundaries of the imagination, it's a perfect playground for writers to explore the possibilities outside the dominant thought paradigms. Science fiction also displays a tension between the reader's present and the imagined future. And this causes something called cognitive estrangement, which is a fertile ground for an exploration of new ways of living and self-organising. This sense of shock or difference breaks us out of our internalised thought patterns. And this can be seen no more so than in fempunk fiction, which this kind of fiction harnesses these elements of cognitive estrangement and literalising metaphors in a way that I believe provokes new imaginings of feminist futures. So each of the texts I'll discuss was chosen for its nuanced, advanced model of feminine identity. We have Nyx Nyssa, who's the protagonist of God's War by Cameron Hurley, and she's bio-enhanced. We have Amy from VN by Madeline Ashby, who is a von Neumann robot with a human father. And Zinzi November in Zoo City by Lauren Bukes becomes both interspecies and interdimensional through her connection with her animal familiar. And as we dip into these texts this morning, it becomes evident that there's a release from binary limitations that we normally attribute to our idea of what makes a woman. But before we really look into these examples a little bit more closely, it's probably helpful to talk about the historical context for gendered binaries that existed in the 80s cyberpunk literature. So traditionally, cyberpunk, it represented masculinity's dominance over technological landscapes and innovations. The male protagonists are generally outsiders, alienated from society, and in danger or opposition to the corporate megalopolis, if you think of Johnny Mnemonic and Henry Dorset Case in Neuromancer. Cyberpunk took a specific view of the future, where globalisation and capitalism have led to the rule of a multinational conglomerate, and marginalised individuals are living in a kind of post-industrial setting, which was defined by cold metal technology, virtual reality, and crime. And I'm borrowing from Carlin Levine in this passage while I talk about cyberpunk. But by the 90s, women writing in the post-cyberpunk space tended to create a sense of community around their protagonists that avoided this sense of the loner or the individualist. Levine says that one of the major differences between masculinist and feminist cyberworks may be how marginalisation is treated as a consequence of the new global order. While early male protagonists are marginalised individuals, later feminist protagonists are closely tied to marginalised communities. So implicit in this viewpoint is this notion of a feminine theme or bias towards community. Now, some cyber feminists agreed with this, And Friedman says that males are theorised to seek and value autonomy, individuation, separation, and the moral ideals of rights and justice. By contrast, females are theorised to seek and value connection, sociality, inclusion, and moral ideals of care and nurturance. I believe that this is just one example of how a traditional binary prescribes identity. In this case, individualism is seen as part of the masculine identity and community as part of the feminine identity. If you pursue this line of thinking, you could assume that women are inherently communitarian, and this would be another discursive construct. Because communitarianism is the idea that humans are social animals, that we're not self-sufficient, and it stands in counterpoint to liberalism or atomism, which advocates the notions of an unencumbered self or the primacy of the natural rights of the human individual. But the fempunk narratives of the 2000s have shifted their focus from this kind of identity making. So there's been a shift past the original, from cyberpunk past the original post-cyberpunk into this kind of fempunk space. And they lean much more strongly towards Donna Haraway's cyber-feminist ideology, which advocates that there is nothing about being female that naturally binds women. She claims there's not even a state of being female, and in her seminal manifesto asks for a reconstruction of identity, which is no longer dictated by biologism and classification, but instead by affinity, where individuals can construct their own groups by choice. So how does fempunk fiction represent these affinity groupings, which differ from the binary social oppositions of lonerism equaling male and community equaling female? How is it different from what predates them? Well, let's firstly look at VN by Madeline Ashby. In VN, the protagonist, Amy, she's a human robot hybrid and an adolescent. Double trouble. She's under threat from her renegade robotic clade mates, and they wish to control her so they can claim her fail-safe immunity. And her fail-safe immunity enables her to freely harm humans, which they're not able to do. And they want to revolt against the humans. So they're pursuing her. At the same time, she's locked in a battle with her grandmother, Portia, who Amy got very, very angry with and ate. And now she's ingested her that Portia's subroutines are trying to control her. At one point, when she's momentarily possessed by Portia, Amy bites off a male friend's thumb and later his son's thumb. And through these acts, she discovers she has an ability to absorb and use the characteristics of any biomaterial she ingests. And in this case, she's now able to jump, leap tall buildings and also has the ability to photosynthesize. So these subroutines of the other cyborgs become Amy's inherited inner community, and they add an intriguing dimension to her social interactions and behaviours. They can also be read as a metaphor for genetic and familial programming. That is how women's subject positions are defined by their ancestral dialogues, by their masculine counterpoints, and by their familial responsibilities. Amy's struggle to function as an individual alongside these subroutines is fundamental to her journey towards the self-realisation that she seeks as she battles those that are trying to mould an identity for her. So she has this internal war against people that are trying to form her identity. So while being tormented internally by Portia and the other VN subroutines, she's forced to leave her traditional family and forge a new identity and new friendships. Her external community orbits around a serial iterator, another robot, another von Neumann robot called Javier. And he and all his clone children become Amy's community of choice. So these kinds of communities are usually the outcome of embarking on a personal journey of redefinition, which is indeed what Amy does, redefining herself both as an adult and something greater than her original cyborg ancestry. Later on in the story, she's physically and mentally transformed by a battle with a sentient sea creature that she defeats. And she's left with the ability to manipulate matter, which would, be a great gift. And using this new capability, she builds a haven of sentient islands for herself and her friends. So not only does she have a community of choice, but also, albeit conflicted, a community of self, referring to her inner community. So Amy's social groupings in VN are kind of a perfect example of dislocated communities and communities of choice that are assembled by a fempunk author who is designing her own vision outside patriarchal values, institutions, traditions, and binaries. In this post-human splice space where Amy transforms, and she transforms from like a von Neumann humanoid robot to a meta cyborg, she chooses her own dislocated, personal, marginalised affinity group, and also becomes literally the architect and manufacturer of her own future. Amy's journey to self-empowerment, self-identification and self-realisation, despite patriarchal and matriarchal oppressors, is profound and successful. And she secures a physical and metaphorical place in the world for herself and her marginalised personal community of choice that dissolves all traditional boundaries. Like Amy, Nyx, the protagonist in God's War by Cameron Hurley, must rely on her wits, skill and courage and physically battle in order to survive in her world. Her identity is determined by her gender and status as a warrior and a hero, but interestingly, those attributes do nothing to elevate her social conditions. So she's faced with trying to thrive or survive, I should say, in a politically complex and dangerous world. And within that, Nyx practices her own version of a kind of liberal individualism, which would be, in traditional cyberpunk, have been prescribed to a masculine viewpoint. This is best illustrated in an exchange that Nyx has with her nemesis, Rain. And Rain says, "I know faith and belief are concepts you have a difficult time understanding, Nyx Nissa, but some of us have an interest in righting wrongs, not perpetuating them." To which Nyx replies, "I believe in myself. That's enough." So despite Nyx's kind of empowerment, her life is far from utopic, and her self-belief is tested when she's stripped of her privilege. She has the privilege of a beldam status, which is bestowed on her by the sisterhood, and she's forced to work as a lowly bounty hunter. So the band of mercenaries she hires become her affinity group and literally fit into what Donna Haraway predicted as cyborg communities that would become monstrous and illegitimate. Nyx's band of outsiders are all oppressed by Nashinian society. One faces continual racial and sexual abuse, another is a refugee, a third fears for his life because of his sexual orientation. But as their leader and a privileged female, and despite her fall from grace with the sisterhood, Nyx has far more power than them in the society. She vacillates between valuing her autonomy and valuing her, and